the massive oak doors of the Oakwood Conservatory of Music felt heavier than usual as 10-year-old Sophia pushed against them. To anyone else, the building looked like a palace of dreams. The lobby was filled with high ceilings that echoed with the sound of violins and flutes. The walls were lined with gold-framed paintings of famous composers, and the air always smelled faintly of expensive perfume and floor wax. But to Sophia, it felt like walking into a lion's den. She clutched her folder of sheet music tight against her chest, her knuckles turning white. The folder wasn't made of leather like the other students'. It was a thin, plastic binder her mother had bought from the grocery store, the kind that tore easily if you weren't careful. Sophia walked with her head down, her eyes fixed on the intricate patterns of the marble floor. She was trying her best to be invisible. In a school filled with designer uniforms and flashy watches, Sophia knew she stood out, and not in a way she wanted. Her blazer was a little too big in the shoulders, hemmed by her mother late at night to make sure the sleeves didn't cover her hands. Her shoes were polished, but they were last year's style, and the soles were worn smooth from the long walk to the bus stop every morning. She could feel the eyes of the other students on her as she passed the lounge area. They sat on velvet couches, laughing about their weekends skiing or horseback riding, holding expensive water bottles. Sophia quickened her pace, her heart beating a little faster. She just wanted to get to the practice rooms. In the practice rooms, nobody cared how much money your parents had. In there, the only thing that mattered was the music. But the hallway to the practice rooms wasn't empty today. Standing in the center of the corridor, like a guard on duty, was Mrs. Sterling. She was the head of the piano department, a woman who carried herself like she was royalty. She was dressed in a sharp black suit, her silver hair pulled back into a tight bun that looked like it hurt. She held a ruler in one hand, tapping it rhythmically against her palm. Sophia swallowed hard. Mrs. Sterling believed that music was a privilege for the wealthy. She didn't say it out loud often, but everyone knew it. She often made comments about how art requires refinement, glancing sideways at the scholarship students as Sophia tried to slip past. Mrs. Sterling stepped in front of her, blocking the path. The tapping of the ruler stopped. "You're late, Sophia," Mrs. Sterling said, her voice cool and sharp. "We do not tolerate tardiness here. It shows a lack of respect for the institution." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Sterling," Sophia whispered, her voice barely audible. The bus was delayed. Mrs. Sterling looked down at Sophia, her eyes narrowing behind her glasses. "Excuses. The students who belong here make their own arrangements. They don't rely on public transportation." She glanced at the plastic binder in Sophia's hands and let out a small, dismissive sigh. "And look at that. How can you expect to play beautifully when you carry your music around in trash? It's sloppy, Sophia. Sloppy clothes, sloppy shoes, sloppy playing. It all connects." Sophia felt her face burn hot with embarrassment. She wanted to argue that her binder was just fine, that her shoes were clean, that she practiced harder than anyone else. But she knew better than to talk back. If she did, she might lose the scholarship. And losing the scholarship meant going back to her old school, where there was no piano program at all. "Yes, Mrs. Sterling," Sophia mumbled, staring at the teacher's shiny black shoes. "Fix your posture," Mrs. Sterling snapped, poking Sophia's shoulder with the ruler. "You look like a wilted flower. Stand tall. Or at least, try to look like you belong." Mrs. Sterling stepped aside, and Sophia hurried past, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. She didn't stop until she reached the small, windowless practice room at the very end of the hall. Room 104. It was the furthest from the lobby, the coldest in the winter, and the one nobody else wanted. Sophia closed the heavy door and locked it, finally letting out a shaky breath. This was her sanctuary. She walked over to the upright piano in the corner. It wasn't a grand piano like the ones on the stage. The ivory keys were slightly yellowed with age, and one of the pedals stuck a little if you pressed it too hard. But Sophia loved this piano. She gently placed her plastic folder on the stand and opened it up. Inside were pages of sheet music, handwritten notes in the margins, and edges that were soft from being turned so many times. Sophia sat down on the bench. The wood was cold. She closed her eyes for a moment, thinking about her mother. Her mom worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices during the day and serving food at night. just to pay for the electricity and the rent. She had saved up for months just to buy Sophia a decent dress for the upcoming winter showcase. Thinking of her mom made the shame in Sophia's chest hardened into something else, determination. She placed her hands on the keys. The silence in the room was heavy, waiting. Sophia took a deep breath and began to play. It started softly, a simple melody, but as she got comfortable, her fingers began to fly. Sophia didn't just read the notes, she felt them. To the other students, the piano was a machine you controlled with strict rules and stiff wrists. To Sophia, it was a voice. It was the only place she could shout, cry, or laugh without anyone hearing her. Her left hand kept a steady, deep rhythm, while her right hand danced over the higher notes, playing a song she had memorized, but never played in class. It was a jazz tune she had heard on the radio, something forbidden by Mrs. Sterling, who insisted on strict classical music only. For 30 minutes, Sophia lost herself in the music. The cold room disappeared, and so did the feeling of her worn-out shoes and the plastic binder. She wasn't the poor girl from the scholarship program anymore. She was a musician. She was powerful. However, time moves fast when you are playing. Suddenly, a sharp knock on the door shattered her concentration. Sophia's hands jerked away from the keys, causing a jarring, discordant noise. She looked up to see Mrs. Sterling opening the door. She hadn't been playing loudly, but the sound of the jazz melody must have drifted out into the hall. "I thought I heard noise," Mrs. Sterling said, stepping inside and sniffing the air as if she smelled something bad. "What was that?" "It certainly wasn't the piece I assigned you for class." Sophia quickly closed her folder, hiding the music. "Nothing, Mrs. Sterling. Just warming up." "It sounded chaotic," Mrs. Sterling said, walking over to the piano. She looked at the keys with distaste, as if they were dirty. "We have a rule here, Sophia. We play what is written. We do not make things up. That is for people who lack the discipline to learn the masters." She leaned down, her face inches from Sophia's. "Do not think that because you have this scholarship you are special. You are here on a trial basis. One mistake, one disruption, and you are back on the street. Do you understand?" Sophia nodded, gripping the edge of the bench until her fingers hurt. "Yes, Mrs. Sterling." "Good," Mrs. Sterling said, straightening up and smoothing her suit. "Class starts in 5 minutes. And wash your hands before you touch the concert hall pianos. I don't want your grime on the ivory keys." She turned and swept out of the room, leaving the door open. The cold air from the hallway rushed in, making Sophia shiver. She looked down at her hands. They looked clean to her. She rubbed them together, trying to wipe away the feeling of the teacher's words. But they stuck like glue. Sophia stood up, packed her folder, and walked toward the door. In the hallway, she passed a group of girls her age. They were wearing expensive watches and holding leather music bags. They were laughing and talking about a famous pianist who was coming to visit the school next week. "Did you see Mrs. Sterling talking to the charity case?" One of the girls whispered, just loud enough for Sophia to hear. "Yeah," another one giggled. "I bet she's telling her she can't play in the showcase. Imagine if she messed up in front of everyone. It would be so embarrassing for the school." Sophia kept walking. She didn't look at them. She told herself that words couldn't hurt her, that the music was stronger. But deep down, she was terrified. The winter showcase was coming up in just a few weeks. It was the biggest event of the year. Every student had to perform. Sophia had practiced her assigned piece, a difficult sonata by Beethoven, until she could play it in her sleep. But Mrs. Sterling's threat echoed in her mind. *1 mistake, and you are out. Asterisk as she entered the main classroom where the grand pianos stood like shiny black ships. The noise died down. The other students took their seats at the best instruments. Sophia was left with the piano in the back corner, the one with a sticky sustain pedal. She sat down, arranged her music, and waited for the lesson to begin. Mrs. Sterling walked to the front of the room. She clapped her hands once, commanding silence. "Attention," she said. "As you know, the Winter Gala is approaching. This is not just a recital. It is a test of character. It is a test of who truly belongs in the world of high art. Her eyes scanned the room, passing over the wealthy students and landing squarely on Sophia. We will be changing the format slightly this year to ensure quality control. A nervous flutter started in Sophia's stomach. She saw a small smirk on Mrs. Sterling's face, a look that made her blood run cold. The teacher had something planned. Sophia knew her talent was real. She could feel the music in her bones, but she also knew that in this building, talent didn't always win. Sometimes, power did, and Mrs. Sterling held all the power. The days that followed the incident in the practice room felt like walking on a tightrope. The entire atmosphere at the conservatory shifted as the date for the winter gala drew closer. The hallways, usually filled with the chaotic sounds of tuning instruments and shouting students, became strangely tense. The wooden floors were polished to a mirror shine, and the busts of famous composers seemed to stare down disapprovingly at anyone who made too much noise. For the wealthy students, this was a time of excitement. They talked about their new dresses, the expensive dinners their parents were booking before the show, the accolades they expected to receive. But for Sophia, the ticking clock was a source of dread. She practiced until her fingers ached, desperate to perfect the Beethoven sonata Mrs. Sterling had assigned. She stayed late after school, often until the janitor came to turn off the lights, ignoring her grumbling stomach and the tiredness in her eyes. She knew she didn't have the expensive lessons or the years of private tutoring the others had. She had to work twice as hard just to be seen as half as good. Every time she made a mistake, she heard Mrs. Sterling's voice in her head, telling her she was sloppy, that she didn't belong. On Tuesday afternoon, the weekly assembly was called. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The great hall was filled with students from all the music departments, string players, wind players, and vocalists, all seated in rows of velvet chairs. At the front stood Mrs. Sterling and the school's director. They looked like judges about to deliver a verdict. The air in the room was thick with anticipation. Sophia sat near the back, her heart hammering against her ribs. She just wanted them to announce the program so she could go back to the safety of the practice room and continue drilling the difficult passages of her sonata. Mrs. Sterling stepped up to the microphone. She didn't smile. She adjusted the stand, the sound screeching through the speakers, before she began to speak. "Students," she said, her voice echoing off the high ceiling. "The Winter Gala is not merely a concert. It is a showcase of the highest standards of this institution. The donors, the board members, and the press will be watching. We cannot afford to present anything less than perfection. Therefore, the faculty has decided to make a bold change to the format this year." A murmur went through the crowd. Students looked at each other, confused. Mrs. Sterling raised a hand to silence them. "We have noticed that some students rely too heavily on rote memorization," she continued, her eyes scanning the room until they locked onto the back row where Sophia sat. "We want to see true musicianship. We want to see the soul behind the notes. For the piano department, this means that instead of the standard repertoire list, some of you will be presented with a unique challenge." Sophia felt a cold drop of sweat slide down her spine. There was something about the way Mrs. Sterling was looking at her. Predator watching its prey that made her stomach turn. Mrs. Sterling began reading the list of names. "Miss Victoria, you will perform the third movement of Mozart's sonata in C major. Miss Julianne, you will handle the Chopin nocturne." As she read the names, the tension in the room broke for the chosen few. They were relieved. Mozart and Chopin were standard. They were difficult, but they had the sheet music. They had been practicing them for months. The students who were named smiled confidently, smoothing their skirts and adjusting their posture. They were safe. But as the list went on, Sophia realized her name hadn't been called yet. There were only a few spots left in the program. Finally, Mrs. Sterling lowered the paper. She looked directly at Sophia. The silence in the room was absolute. "You could hear a pin drop, Sophia," Mrs. Sterling said, her voice dropping to a tone that sounded almost gentle, but in a way that was terrifying. "We have saved a very special spot for you." Sophia swallowed hard. "Will I be playing the Beethoven, Mrs. Sterling?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I have it almost ready." Mrs. Sterling let out a small, tight laugh. "No, Sophia. We have decided that the Beethoven is too rigid for you. We want to give you the freedom to express yourself. You see, there is a slot in the middle of the lobby right before the intermission. It is a high-traffic area where the donors will be gathering for refreshments. We want you to perform there. Sophia felt her breath catch in her throat. What? What piece? That is the challenge, Mrs. Sterling said, a cruel smile touching the corners of her lips. You will perform an improvisation. 10 minutes. No sheet music. Just you and the piano. Show us the natural talent that got you this scholarship. Show us that you don't need the structure that our other students rely on. The room erupted in gasps and whispers. To a classical musician, telling a student to improvise for 10 minutes in front of an audience wasn't a challenge. It was a death sentence. It was unheard of. These students spent their lives learning to play exactly what was written on the page, down to the exact dynamic. Improvisation was a skill for jazz players or street performers, not for conservatory students. To ask a 10-year-old to fill 10 minutes of silence with nothing but her imagination was setting her up to fail. It was asking her to stand up there, choke, and humiliate herself in front of everyone who mattered. But, Mrs. Sterling, Sophia stammered, standing up involuntarily. I haven't. I don't know how to improvise for that long. I haven't practiced it. I need the music. Sit down, Mrs. Sterling snapped, the false kindness vanishing instantly. This is the decision of the board. If you cannot handle a little creativity, perhaps you aren't cut out for this program after all. Perhaps you are just a robot who can only copy what she sees on paper. We are looking for artists, Sophia.
How?
The whispers grew louder. Some students were giggling behind their hands. They didn't realize the cruelty of the task. They just thought it was a weird, avant-garde experiment. Or maybe they did realize it, and they were happy it wasn't them. Sophia sat back down, her hands shaking so badly she had to clasp them together in her lap. She felt like she was going to be sick. The rest of the assembly was a blur. Sophia didn't hear a single other word. All she could think about was the lobby. She pictured the grand piano standing there alone, surrounded by wealthy people holding champagne glasses, staring at her. She pictured the silence stretching on and on as her brain froze, and she couldn't find a single note to play. She pictured Mrs. Sterling standing in the corner with her arms crossed, a look of triumph on her face as she finally proved that the scholarship girl was a fraud. When the assembly was finally dismissed, the students rushed out in a buzz of excitement, talking about their pieces and their dresses. Sophia walked slowly, dragging her feet. She wanted to run to the bathroom and hide, but she knew Mrs. Sterling might be watching. She had to keep her composure. She made her way to the practice rooms, her mind racing. How could she do this? She knew chords. Sure, she knew scales. But to play for 10 minutes without stopping? That was like asking someone to write a novel without a pen. She sat down at the old upright piano in room 104 and placed her hands on the keys. She tried to play a simple melody, but it sounded childish and hollow. She stopped. She tried again, but her fingers felt stiff, clumsy. The fear had paralyzed her. Every time she touched a key, she imagined the sound of people laughing. She spent the next 2 hours staring at the wall, tears silently rolling down her cheeks and dripping onto her lap. She thought about her mother, who was working so hard to give her this chance. How could she tell her that she was going to be humiliated? How could she tell her that the teacher had set a trap and walked right into it? The door to the practice room suddenly swung open. Sophia jumped, wiping her face frantically with her sleeve. Standing in the doorway was Mrs. Sterling. She hadn't made a sound when she opened the door. "Practicing your improvisation?" Mrs. Sterling asked, leaning against the doorframe. "I certainly hope so. You wouldn't want to bore our donors." "I'm trying," Sophia whispered. Mrs. Sterling walked into the room and closed the door behind her. The small space suddenly felt suffocating. "You know, Sophia," she said softly, walking over to the piano, "I've been watching you. You play the notes on the page perfectly, technically, but there is no soul. You are just a machine." She reached out and slammed the lid of the piano down onto Sophia's fingers. Sophia pulled them back just in time, gasping. "This improvisation is your chance to prove me wrong," Mrs. Sterling hissed, leaning down so her face was inches from Sophia's. "But I don't think you can do it. I think on the night of the gala, you are going to sit there, frozen like a statue. And everyone is going to see that you are nothing but a charity case with a cheap folder and worn-out shoes. And when you fail, I will be there to take back this scholarship and give it to someone who actually deserves it." Mrs. Sterling stood up and straightened her jacket, her expression returning to one of cold indifference. "Don't disappoint your mother, Sophia. She worked so hard for you. It would be a shame if all her effort went to waste because you weren't talented enough." She turned and walked out. Leaving the door open behind her, Sophia sat frozen in the silence of the room. The anger began to rise in her chest, hot and sharp, pushing away the fear. She looked at the piano keys, at the yellowed ivory. Mrs. Sterling wanted her to fail. She wanted her to crawl away in shame. She thought that because the night of the winter gala finally arrived, and the Oakwood Conservatory had transformed completely. The usually stern and quiet hallways were now glowing with the warm light of 1,000 crystal chandeliers. The floors, which Sophia walked across every day in her worn-out sneakers, were now covered in plush red carpets that felt soft like clouds. The air didn't smell of floor wax anymore. It smelled of expensive perfume, fresh flowers, and rich food. It felt like a different world, a fairy tale world where everything sparkled and everyone smiled. But for Sophia, it felt like walking into a dream where she was the only one who didn't belong. She stood in a corner of the main lobby, clutching her program until the edges crumpled. She was wearing a dress her mother had bought for her. It was a simple blue dress, not made of silk like the other girls were wearing, but it was clean. And her mother had ironed it until it was perfectly smooth. To Sophia, it was the most beautiful dress in the world because she knew how many hours her mother had worked to pay for it. However, looking around at the crowd of wealthy parents in tuxedos and glittering jewelry, she felt painfully out of place. She felt like a single speck of dust on a shiny diamond. Her mother was standing a few feet away, talking quietly to a teacher. Her mom looked tired. She always looked tired after her double shifts, but her eyes were shining brightly as she looked at Sophia. She had a smile plastered on her face, the kind of smile you wear when you are trying to be brave for someone you love. It broke Sophia's heart to see it. Her mom thought this was a big moment, a chance for her talented daughter to shine. She didn't know it was a trap. She didn't know Mrs. Sterling had set Sophia up to fail. Sophia had wanted to tell her, but she couldn't bear to see the worry in her mother's eyes. So she kept the secret, swallowed the fear, and nodded when her mom whispered, "Good luck, my love. I'm so proud of you." The lobby was chaotic. Waiters in white uniforms moved through the crowd, carrying silver trays with glasses of champagne and fancy hors d'oeuvres. Important donors with loud laughter and deep voices filled the room. In the center of all this noise stood the piano. It was a massive, gleaming black Steinway grand piano. It looked like a throne. It was polished until Sophia could see her own reflection in the wood. This wasn't the dusty upright in the back of room 104. This was a machine built for perfection. And right in the middle of the biggest party of the year, Sophia was supposed to sit there and improvise for 10 minutes. Mrs. Sterling appeared from the crowd. It's like a shark gliding through water. She looked impeccable in her black suit, her silver hair tight, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of disorder. She spotted Sophia standing alone and walked over with a swift, crisp pace. "You are trembling," Mrs. Sterling said, her voice low so the guests wouldn't hear. She didn't sound concerned. She sounded annoyed. "Stop that immediately. You look weak. Do not let the donors see you sweat." "I'm trying," Sophia whispered, her voice shaking. It's very loud in here." "Music requires focus," Mrs. Sterling snapped. "If you are distracted by a little conversation, then you have no future in this art." She checked her watch. "You are on in 2 minutes. I expect you to be respectful of the instrument. Do not bang on it like a savage. Remember, this is a test of your character." Mrs. Sterling walked away and climbed the small steps leading to a temporary stage set up near the piano. She tapped the microphone, causing a sharp squeal of feedback that made everyone in the lobby wince. The chatter died down slowly as people turned their attention to the front. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please," Mrs. Sterling's voice boomed, smooth and confident. "We are so delighted to have you here tonight. We have wonderful performances scheduled in the main hall, but we wanted to bring a special treat to you here in the lobby during this intermission." Sophia felt the blood drain from her face. This was it. "We have a student here who is quite unique," Mrs. Sterling continued, pausing for effect. Sophia saw a few people in the crowd raising their eyebrows, sipping their drinks, while many of our students rely on the great masters to guide their playing. This young lady believes in expressing her own voice. Tonight, she will be performing a spontaneous, improvisational piece for you. A raw display of natural talent. There was a polite smattering of applause, but mostly confusion. Improvisation? At a classical gala? The people in the crowd looked at each other, shrugging. They expected a polished performance, not a child making things up on the spot. They whispered to their neighbors, some looking bored, already turning back to their conversations. To them, Sophia wasn't a performer. She was background noise, a little intermission entertainment. "Please welcome." "Sophia," Mrs. Sterling said, gesturing toward the corner where Sophia stood frozen. The walk to the piano felt like the longest journey of her life. Sophia could feel hundreds of eyes on her. She felt small, fragile, like a glass figurine that could shatter at any moment. As she walked, she heard snippets of conversations. "How bold," a man in a tuxedo scoffed. "Is she one of the scholarship students?" "Adorable," a woman in a fur coat whispered. Sophia reached the piano and sat down on the bench. It was higher than she was used to. She had to stretch her legs to reach the pedals. The massive black lid of the piano was open, reflecting the chandeliers above. It felt like the piano was looming over her, judging her. The keys were white and perfect, staring back at her, waiting for a mistake. The room was still noisy. People were laughing, glasses were clinking, waiters were rushing by. Nobody was really listening. They didn't care. She looked out into the sea of faces. She saw her mother standing near the back. Her mother had stopped smiling. She was standing on her tiptoes, trying to see over a tall man. Her hands clasped together in front of her chest, her eyes filled with worry. She sensed that something was wrong. Mrs. Sterling was standing just to the side of the stage, her arms crossed over her chest. She wasn't smiling anymore. She was staring at Sophia with a look of cold expectation. She was waiting for the silence. She was waiting for Sophia to panic, to freeze, to prove that she didn't belong here. Sophia could almost hear her thoughts. Asterisk, give up. Go home. Asterisk, Sophia placed her shaking hands on her lap. She took a deep breath, but the air felt thin. The room was spinning. 10 minutes. How was she supposed to play for 10 minutes? Her mind was a complete blank. She tried to remember a scale, a simple chord, but the fear was a wall blocking everything. She looked at the keys, and they looked like strangers. A waiter dropped a tray with a loud crash nearby. The sound made Sophia jump, and a small laugh rippled through the crowd near the back. It was a humiliating sound. They were laughing at her already. She hadn't even played a note. Mrs. Sterling took a step closer to the piano, her eyes narrowing. She whispered loudly enough for Sophia to hear, "We don't have all night, Sophia. Play." It was a command, but it was also a trigger. For weeks, Sophia had let this woman push her around. She had let her make her feel small, dirty, and unworthy. She had let her mock her clothes and her mother. She had let her set this impossible trap. And now, standing on this stage, with her mother watching and the rich people ignoring her, Sophia realized that she had nothing left to lose. If she played a classical piece perfectly, they would say it was boring. If she played nothing, they would say she was a failure. So she had to do something else. She had to stop trying to please Mrs. Sterling. Sophia closed her eyes. She blocked out the lights, the noise, the expensive perfume, and the stares. She imagined she was back in room 104. She imagined the rain beating against the window. She thought about the struggle of getting up every morning, the cold bus rides, the tired eyes of her mother, and the fire in her own chest that refused to go out. She thought about how much she hated being looked down on. The silence stretched on. It became uncomfortable. People started shifting their weight, clearing their throats. Mrs. Sterling smirked, thinking it was over. But then Sophia lifted her hands. She didn't place them gently like she was taught. She hovered them for just a second, feeling the vibration of the strings inside the massive wooden beast. She wasn't thinking about notes. She wasn't thinking about rules. She was thinking about truth. Her right hand came down hard on the keys, striking a single deep bass note that rang out like a gunshot in the crowded lobby. The noise cut through the chatter instantly. A few people jumped, spilling their drinks. The laughter died instantly. The room went dead silent, and that was just the beginning. That single deep bass note hung in the air like a heavy cloud, silencing the room instantly. It wasn't a polite beginning to a song. It was a statement. Before the shock of the sound could fade, Sophia's hands began to move. She didn't start with a slow, gentle melody like the other students usually did. She started with a rhythm. It was a low, thumping beat in her left hand, steady and relentless. Like a heartbeat or a train moving down a track, her right hand hesitated for just a split second. And then it flew onto the keys. The sound that came out wasn't the rigid, structured music of Beethoven or Mozart. It was something else entirely. It was a sound that felt like rain. The notes were falling fast, sometimes tumbling over each other, but somehow always landing in the right place. It was chaotic, but controlled. Wild, but precise. The people in the lobby stopped talking. The man who had been laughing at the clumsy waiter froze with his glass halfway to his lips. The woman in the fur coat turned away from her friend, her eyes narrowing as she searched for the source of this strange, captivating noise. They had expected a child to fumble. They expected silence or silly random noises. They did not expect this. Sophia's eyes were closed tight. She couldn't see the audience anymore, and she didn't want to. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she was back in her small apartment. She was remembering the sound of the radiator hissing in the winter, the feeling of the cold wind hitting her face at the bus stop, and the sound of her mother crying softly in the kitchen when she thought Sophia was asleep. All those emotions that she had swallowed down for months, the fear, the anger, the loneliness came rushing out through her fingertips. The music changed. The steady beat in her left hand grew faster, turning into a driving force. Her right hand danced up the high keys, playing sharp. Bright notes that sounded like laughter, but not the mocking laughter of the students. It was the laughter of survival, of being tough. The tempo increased. The song was getting louder, filling the massive lobby. It bounced off the marble floors and the high ceilings, surrounding the wealthy crowd in a wall of sound that they couldn't ignore. Mrs. Sterling stood near the stage, her arms crossed tightly. She was waiting for it to fall apart. She was waiting for Sophia to hit a wrong note, to lose the rhythm, to run out of ideas. She checked her watch, expecting this embarrassment to be over quickly. But the seconds ticked by, and the music didn't stop. It was getting better. It was getting stronger. Sophia's hands were moving so fast they were almost a blur. She wasn't even looking at the keys anymore. She was playing by feel, by instinct. She pressed down on the pedals with her worn-out shoes, making the sound swell and fade like ocean waves. It was a complex song, full of ups and downs, twists and turns. It sounded like a conversation between two people arguing and then making up. It sounded like a storm passing through a quiet town in the back of the room. Sophia's mother had covered her mouth with her hands. Tears were streaming down her face, smudging her carefully applied makeup. She recognized the song in a way. It wasn't a famous classical piece. It was the sound of their life. It was the struggle, the hard work, and the love that kept them going. She saw her daughter sitting on that big bench, looking so small, yet creating a sound so big that it seemed to shake the chandeliers. She wasn't just watching a performance. She was watching her daughter's soul pouring out. The crowd was mesmerized. A little boy who had been fidgeting with his tie stopped and stared, his mouth open. A group of wealthy donors, who usually only cared about their tax deductions and their social status, found themselves leaning in. They stopped checking their phones. They stopped sipping their drinks. The arrogance of the room evaporated, replaced by a raw human energy that transcended money and status. For the first time that night, they weren't judging the scholarship girl. They were witnessing something real. Mrs. Sterling's face began to twitch. The confident smirk she wore earlier was gone. Her plan was crumbling. She had set a trap thinking the mouse would get caught. Instead, the mouse was roaring. She looked around and saw the faces of the donors, the people she needed to impress. They weren't bored. They were spellbound. A man near the front, a famous critic known for his harsh reviews, had actually taken his glasses off to listen more closely. Mrs. Sterling felt a cold knot of fear form in her stomach. She realized she had made a terrible mistake. She had tried to humiliate a girl who had more power in her 10 fingers than Mrs. Sterling had in her entire institution. Sophia hit a section of the music that was incredibly fast. Her fingers were pounding the keys now, the notes clashing together in a beautiful, chaotic storm. The piano was vibrating, shaking the floor beneath the bench. She was pouring all her anger into the instrument, her anger at the unfairness, the cruelty, the feeling of being invisible. It was a rage that was pure and artistic. It was the sound of someone refusing to be broken. And then, just as the music reached a fever pitch, a deafening roar of sound. Sophia pulled her hands back. She didn't stop playing completely, but the heavy bass vanished. The fast notes stopped. She transitioned instantly into a soft, gentle melody. It was like the sun coming out after a thunderstorm. The notes were simple, clear, and incredibly sad. It was a melody of longing. It was the sound of a child wanting a better life, a mother wanting to give more, a dream that seemed just out of reach. The silence in the lobby during this quiet part was even heavier than before. You could hear people breathing. The contrast between the loud storm and this soft sadness was heartbreaking. Sophia swayed slightly with the music, her body moving with the natural rhythm of the song. She wasn't worrying about technique or what her teacher would say. She wasn't thinking about the scholarship. She was just free. For these few minutes, she wasn't the poor girl or the charity case. She was a creator. She was a master. The piano, which had felt like a stranger earlier, was now an extension of her body. The final stretch of the song began to build again, layering notes upon notes, creating a rich tapestry of sound. It was complicated music, the kind that professional players spent years trying to master. Yet here was a 10-year-old, playing without sheet music, weaving melodies together as easily as if she were breathing. She played one final, haunting chord that resonated through the entire building, hanging in the air like a question mark, before slowly fading into complete and utter silence. Sophia pulled her hands away from the keys and placed them gently on her lap. She kept her eyes closed for a moment, letting the echo disappear. She was breathing hard, her chest rising and falling rapidly from the exertion. She was terrified to open her eyes. She didn't know if they would clap, or if they would laugh, or if Mrs. Sterling would scream at her for making such a scene. She sat there waiting for the world to come back into focus. The silence stretched on for 3 seconds. 4 seconds. 5 seconds. Then, a man in the front row slowly stood up. He was an older man with white hair and a kind face. He didn't say anything. He just looked at the little girl at the piano and began to clap. Slowly at first, just a tap of his palms together. Then, a woman stood up next to him. Then another. Within moments, the entire lobby was on their feet. The applause wasn't the polite clapping you hear at boring parties. It was a thunderous roar. It was a wall of sound that matched the music Sophia had just played. People were whistling, shouting "Bravo," and wiping tears from their eyes. Sophia finally opened her eyes. She saw a sea of people, standing, smiling, clapping for her. But she didn't look at them for long. She looked to the side of the stage, to the shadows where Mrs. Sterling was standing. The teacher wasn't clapping. She was standing frozen, her face pale, her mouth hanging slightly open. She looked like she had seen a ghost. The realization hit Sophia like a warm wave. She had won. She hadn't just survived the trap. She had destroyed it. She had stunned everyone, just like the title promised. And as the applause washed over her, Sophia finally smiled a real, genuine smile. She wasn't invisible anymore. The applause didn't just stop. It seemed to grow like a wave crashing against the shore, getting louder and louder with every passing second. For Sophia, sitting on the bench of the massive Steinway, the sound was overwhelming. It wasn't just clapping. It was a roar of approval that vibrated in her chest. Her ears were ringing, but it wasn't the bad kind of ring she got when she was nervous. It was the feeling of being heard, truly heard, for the first time in her life. She sat there for a moment, her hands resting on her lap, her breathing shallow and fast. She looked out at the sea of people standing up, their faces turned toward her, smiling, clapping, some with tears in their eyes. Slowly, Sophia stood up. Her legs felt a little shaky, like jelly, after the intense physical exertion of the performance. She curtsied awkwardly, the way she had seen girls do in movies, but with a bit of her own style. The crowd seemed to love this small, humble gesture even more, and another wave of cheers erupted. Through the bright lights and the blur of faces, she saw a figure pushing through the crowd from the back. It was her mother. She wasn't walking. She was almost running, ignoring the shocked looks of the wealthy donors she bumped into. She reached the front of the stage, her eyes red and puffy from crying, her hands trembling. Sophia stepped down from the platform and into her mother's arms. It wasn't a polite hug. It was a tight, fierce squeeze, the kind of hug that says, "I've got you and I'm so proud all at once." "You did it," her mother whispered over the noise of the crowd, her voice cracking. "You did it, my love. You were amazing." Sophia buried her face in her mother's shoulder, smelling the familiar scent of her soap and the old perfume she wore. It was grounding. "I played what I felt, Mom," Sophia whispered back. "I just played what was inside." "You are a star," her mother said, pulling back to wipe Sophia's tears with her rough, gentle thumbs. "Don't let anyone ever tell you differently." Meanwhile, Mrs. Sterling was standing near the edge of the stage, gripping a clipboard so hard her knuckles were turning white. Her plan had failed completely. She had expected silence, awkwardness, and failure. Instead, she had created a hero. The donors were not looking at her with admiration for organizing the event. They were looking past her, annoyed that she was blocking their view of the little girl. Mrs. Sterling tried to catch the eye of the school's director, but he was busy clapping enthusiastically, a huge smile on his face. The cold knot in Mrs. Sterling's stomach tightened. She realized that her authority, usually so absolute in this building, was crumbling in front of her. An older man, a famous conductor who had flown in just for the gala, stepped forward. He ignored Mrs. Sterling completely. He walked straight to Sophia and her mother. The crowd quieted down, wanting to hear what this musical legend would say. "My dear," the old man said, his voice raspy but warm. He gently took Sophia's hand in his. "I have been playing music for 60 years. I have heard the best pianists in the world play in the grandest halls. And I tell you this, what you just did, that was not just playing. That was speaking with your soul. You have a gift that cannot be taught in a classroom." The crowd murmured in agreement. Sophia blushed, looking down at her shoes. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. "Who is your teacher?" the conductor asked, turning to look around the room. Who nurtured this incredible intuition? The room went silent. Everyone's eyes shifted to Mrs. Sterling. This was her moment. She was the head of the department. She should have stepped forward, taken a bow, and claimed some credit for discovering such a talent, even if she hated the girl. But Mrs. Sterling couldn't do it. She knew the truth. She had tried to crush this talent. She had tried to humiliate the girl into quitting. To take credit now would be a lie, and with everyone looking at her, she felt exposed. She stood, frozen, her face pale, unable to speak. "She doesn't have a teacher for that," Sophia's mother spoke up, her voice loud and clear. Cutting through the tension, she looked directly at Mrs. Sterling, her eyes flashing with a protective fire that surprised everyone. "That was my daughter. That was her heart. The school tried to teach her rules, but she plays from her spirit." The conductor raised an eyebrow, glancing from the trembling teacher to the fierce mother. He nodded slowly, a look of deep respect in his eyes. "Well," he said, "then she is her own best master." He turned back to Sophia. "You must promise me you will never stop playing. The world needs to hear what you have to say." "I promise," Sophia said. The conductor patted her hand and walked away. But the energy in the room had shifted permanently. The charity case was no longer a joke. She was the star of the evening. The other students, the ones who had laughed at her folder and her shoes, now looked at her with a mix of awe and jealousy. They realized that no amount of money could buy the kind of magic Sophia had just created. They could play the notes perfectly. They couldn't make the music breathe the way she did. Mrs. Sterling, seeing that she had lost control of the room, quickly turned on her heel and walked away. She didn't look back. She disappeared into the shadows of the hallway, defeated by the very thing she despised: raw, unpolished talent. The whispers started immediately as people watched her retreat. They had seen her cruelty in the setup, and they had seen her defeat in the outcome. Her reputation at the conservatory would never be the same after tonight, the gala continued. But for Sophia, the night was over. She didn't need to hear the other students play their perfect, rehearsed sonatas. She had said everything she needed to say. With her mother holding her hand, she walked through the lobby. People reached out to pat her on the back or shake her hand as she passed. "That was beautiful," a woman in a fur coat said. Smiling sincerely, "Credible," a man in a tuxedo added. Sophia accepted their praise with a shy smile. But she didn't let go of her mother's hand. The two of them walked out of the grand double doors and into the cold night air. The difference between the inside and the outside was shocking. Inside was warmth, chandeliers, and applause. Outside was dark, quiet, and chilly. But as they walked toward the bus stop, Sophia didn't feel the cold. She felt taller, like she had grown 3 inches in the last hour. The weight that had been pressing down on her chest for months, the fear of not being good enough, the shame of being poor, was gone. "Do you think they will kick me out, Mom?" Sophia asked quietly as they sat on the wooden bench waiting for the bus. Mrs. Sterling looked really angry. Her mother laughed, a real joyful sound that echoed in the empty street. "They can't kick you out, Sophia. Not after tonight. The whole world knows who you are now. And if they are stupid enough to try, we will find a place that deserves you. You are a musician. You proved it." Sophia looked up at the stars twinkling above the city buildings. She thought about the piano, about the way the notes had felt under her fingers, and about the look on Mrs. Sterling's face when the applause started. It made her smile. She realized something important as the bus approached, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Talent wasn't about how much money you had or what kind of clothes you wore. It wasn't about following rules or pleasing people who looked down on you. Talent was a fire inside you. It didn't matter if you had a leather folder or a plastic one, or if your shoes were worn out. When you sat down to play, none of that existed. All that existed was the music. The bus doors hissed open. Sophia stood up, holding her mother's hand, and stepped onto the bus. She wasn't just a scholarship student anymore. She wasn't the girl Mrs. Sterling tried to humiliate. She was Sophia, the girl who stunned everyone. And as the bus drove away from the fancy school and back to their small apartment, Sophia knew that this was just the beginning of her story. The music would never stop now.